So, dear participants, let us proceed with the panel on the economic domain so that we can efficiently move towards the very nice part of our day of lunch. So hopefully this discussion will serve for a good appetite, as indeed it could be could be outlined as perhaps one of the more non-visible parts of the Chinese influence. At the same time, perhaps we could say that it would have some of the most significant long-term effects, especially if we talk about it from the perspective of not only finance and infrastructure in terms of material things that we can see and observe, but also if we talk about the battle for hearts and minds, where of course it is important from the perspective of education, if we talk about primary and secondary education, which has been in the purview of the Chinese influence expansion, but as well there is the connection with the domain of higher education and science, which in one way or another, of course, is connected with matters of finance and infrastructure in terms of emergent technologies, and in other ways that we could observe the Chinese influence for the national interest purposes that we could identify in the research that our brilliant experts have done so far. And so to tell a little bit more about the panel that we are having to discuss this very important subject. So on my right, we have Ms. Pendrakowska, who is the head and founder of the Boym Institute in Warsaw. The institute deals with Asian and global studies, and I'm very happy that one of the rising stars in researching this region in Poland is part of this panel today. She's also a PhD candidate of the Humboldt University in Berlin, so the city is also very well known to her, so I'm very glad that we have this Baltic link and we are well connected in the region. Then on my further right is Mr. Kollakowski, who is the research fellow at the German Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies. And of course, we at the Baltic Security Foundation have enjoyed cooperation with the Institute before, and we appreciate very much his perspective from the German side about the role of China in these questions. Then further on, we have Mr. Skirius, who is the co-founder of the Civic Resilience Initiative and a former advisor to the Member of Parliament. And as we know, he is an expert in digital security and media literacy, and we at the Baltic Security Foundation have been very glad to cooperate with him and the Civic Resilience Initiative in developing a media literacy toolkit for the journalists of the Baltic states. So I'm glad to have you back, and thank you for your contribution. And furthermore, on this panel, we have Professor Groenendijk. I hopefully pronounced it correctly. And he is a professor of a public policy organization at Inland University of Norway. And I'm very glad that we are able to cover these parts of the Baltic Sea region, both geographically but also politically, noting that, of course, the interests that China has in Norway are well connected to a region that is closer to the Baltic states, and I think that it is important that we look at them in connection to others. So I'm very thankful for your participation today and for your contribution. And perhaps, as this is probably one of the least covered topics or subjects, not only in our research but also for our participants, I will let you to provide your remarks with regard to what was the most interesting and most surprising that you found with regard to China's presence, China's involvement, and China's interest in the domain of education, as indeed there is more than meets the eye. Perhaps we can start with Ms. Pendrakowska.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank you so much also for having us here. It's a pleasure to discuss all these interesting topics together. I would like to start with a story, because I somehow, got that idea after the speech, that maybe I should start with a story that will be not entirely connected to China, but at the Boym Institute we're also a part of an e-Engage project, which is governed by the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Singapore, Diplomatic Academy in Vietnam and Cambodia, and we're somehow looking what we can do together, you know, also in terms of building community with Indo-Pacific region, I would name it this way. What was absolutely striking for me is that the Asian partners with whom we are working, who are like young researchers, they have very limited knowledge on Europe. And during our recent event, which took place in Berlin 1 month or 2 months ago, I was somehow thrown to a debate with a question, can EU set an example for ASEAN? And there was like voting and people said no, like 70% was no, absolutely, we don't want EU as an example. So my role was to change their minds. And it was absolutely, you know, nearly impossible to do. They were so much, you know, against ASEAN looking after the EU. But there was one argument that came to my mind, and in the end we won the debate. It was showing them my Polish ID card and telling them, imagine you have such an ID card and you can travel from Cambodia to Vietnam, look for work there, then go for studies in Thailand, then finally go for an internship in Singapore and set up in Malaysia without a problem, with a single card and one health insurance. And this is how we somehow made this debate work for the EU. But I think it's like really important for us when we think about China, when we think about Asia, really to determine whether the partners really understand our culture, our values, the way we work, and what we represent. And I think this is the biggest challenge, and I'm really glad that this point was made. It was about NATO, but I think the similar level of knowledge might be attributed to the EU. So now let me go back to the real topic of my presentation. So I come from Poland, and I graduated from sinology at the University of Warsaw, which is the oldest sinology department in the country. So part of my observations is based on, you know, like real life experience. And I really think, although there is a huge debate in Europe about the Chinese influence in CEE, I would say that we did it right, because sinology departments in Poland, particularly Warsaw University, always has the Chinese mainland way and the Taiwanese teachers. So we always do everything in parallel. So we have Taiwanese teachers, Chinese mainland teachers. We have books for 3 years published in Taiwan, and we have books published in mainland China. So we never go on one side, whether it's China or Taiwan. We try to maintain the balance and navigate the risks. And I would say that's a very good practice that could be repeated at other universities. The other takeaway we have that the Chinese-led format 16+1, right now 14+1, and the Belt and Road Initiative have contributed to the intensification of academic exchanges and research cooperation between China and Poland. I believe that's a fact. Although we started academic cooperation in 1930s, when the department, sinology department in Poland was opened, we continued in the 50s and 60s as part of, friends of the Soviet bloc. And then in the 80s and 90s, we also had exchanges with China. So it's quite a long story of cooperation, but it all somehow bloomed after 2012 and 2013. So after China somehow set up its bigger plans for Central and Eastern Europe. And the interest in deepening cooperation came from both sides. So the cooperation developed on the central and local levels and was supported by public and private universities and NGOs. And new research centers and academic courses dedicated to Asian affairs and China studies were established, particularly between 2015 and 2018 as an attempt to develop and deepen Polish understanding of East Asia. So it's also important that it was not only dedicated towards BRI or towards 16+1, it was also about Poland understanding the global situations and the tensions between Beijing and Washington. So it was like part of understanding the global shifts. And in recent years, Confucius Institutes grew their network in Poland, and their presence raised concerns and was critically assessed as tools for promoting China's interests, for example, by the Polish Institute of International Affairs. So these discussions were very active and very vivid in Poland, and also the Sinology department where I studied blocked the Confucius Institute. It was already in 2012. And Polish public universities, including the University of Warsaw, seem to balance their education offer by including both Taiwanese and mainland Chinese curriculum into their studies. And the last remark from my side, because I know I'm running out of time, is that everything changed when COVID-19 struck. Because like the ties, the academic exchanges were brought to the standstill. So there are people who study in China, but they have to do it online. So it kind of builds another kind of landscape. So following up the question from our first speaker, I believe that the risk here is that because we don't have contacts with China, like people-to-people exchange and all that stuff, we have like rise of nationalism in China. And if you look at digital platforms in China, we can really feel that there is a huge anti-West resentment building up. The second takeaway, we have less experts on China. That's another problem that it's emerging, that many people leave the field of sinological studies. And third, I feel that experts in China who participated in academic exchanges, they are not understand right now, because they can't talk freely with us in Europe or in the States. They're kind of becoming like maybe more propaganda oriented, more nationalistic, because they don't have this chance for a proper like exchange face to face. So that would be it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, so I have the microphone here. So let's continue, please, with the German perspective. Thank you.
Okay, I will keep it very brief, as we are running a little bit behind schedule, and maybe we have a little bit more time for the question-answer session then. When you asked what was the most surprising thing that we came across, I think the most astonishing thing really was how deep we have fallen. I don't know if you remember, in March 2014, General Secretary Xi Jinping visited Berlin, and a joint declaration between the German government and the Chinese government was released. The idea was to hold regular meetings on global security issues. There was hope that mutual cooperation between Berlin and Beijing could help to contribute to conflict management with regard to conflicts such as Ukraine, Syria, Afghanistan. China's lukewarm response to the annexation of Crimea, China abstaining from the vote in the UN Security Council, not voting with Russia, and their immediate emphasis on the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of any sovereign country raised hopes that maybe China could help to somewhat moderate Russian policies. And at the end of the summit, comprehensive strategic partnership between Germany and China was declared, which also had some implications for the armed forces, which we can talk about a little bit later. And now, almost a decade later, cooperative measures between the Bundeswehr, Germany's federal armed forces, and the People's Liberation Army have been greatly reduced. This also includes, and we can talk about that a little bit further into the discussion, the training and education aspect. For many years now, the German attaché staff in Beijing has great difficulties, is severely limited in in fulfilling the role that an attaché staff is normally supposed to fulfill as a liaison. Regarding the liaison function between both militaries. And of course, one of the most drastic aspects has been China denying the German government's request for a port visit in September last year, when we wanted to visit Shanghai. So to provide a short summary, I would say concerning the military-to-military relation aspect, we have witnessed a very unfortunate and tragic development.
I'm gonna put timer in order not to be too long, because there's much to say. Yeah, so regarding the educational perspective, the domain, we probably will all agree that China has been primarily interested in cooperation in natural science and the high-tech technologies with the Western universities. It is only natural as Lithuania becomes a country of high-tech. For instance, the good example is that Lithuania recently became one of the global leaders in the field of laser technologies, and with the universities making a really slow, but steady headway in international rankings, the attention from the Chinese universities continues to increase. The topic of cooperation with the Chinese universities has long attracted attention of the communities in Western countries, the security communities, and for good reason. According to the publicly available information, the 4 largest universities in Lithuania have at least 40 bilateral cooperation agreements with their Chinese counterparts. However, there is one quite exceptional case, and the recent one. Kaunas Vytautas Magnus University, the second Lithuanian university, has just recently signed the agreement cooperation with the infamous Nanjing University of Aeronautics and Astronautics. It is surprisingly, knowing the political tensions in Lithuania and knowing the recent history about Chinese counterpart. According to the China Defense University Tracker, which is made by Australian Strategic Policy Institute. For those who don't know, the tracker, it's the instrument which helps, which basically helps universities and researchers to understand the institutions inside the China and avoid harmful collaborations. So according to the tracker and its information, the particular Chinese university is a top secret and a very high risk institution, which has at least once been involved in a famous espionage scandal which happened in the United States, and probably our colleagues from US know more about that. So, and besides cooperation between high education institutions, there is a need to mention another Chinese presence in educational domain in Lithuanian case. At the beginning of 2019, Lithuanian intelligence authorities published the yearly assessment of threats to national security. And in this report, Chinese activities were singled out as an active threat for its security for the first time in Lithuanian history. Like its activities in other countries, in Lithuania, Chinese intelligence operates under diplomatic cover and exploits various different organizations and single individuals. Since our topic is about educational domain, from the report we can see 2 spheres related to that. So PRC exploits, firstly, Confucius Institute in Lithuania, which is funded by the government, and Confucius Institute is the first and the largest Chinese language and cultural center of Lithuania. Of course, primary objectives of the institute is purely to promote the soft power of China. Institute seeks to strengthen sinology studies and promote scientific research and academic exchange and introduce Chinese culture. The second sphere, which according to the intelligence reports mentions that PRC exploits, is Chinese students studying abroad. It is assumed that the Chinese government is trying to influence student groups, solitary students, or Chinese diaspora association members, either directly through funding or indirectly by reporting that they are being monitored or their families being monitored by back in China. Therefore, China works here in the field of human information collection. I ran out of time, but for the following discussion, maybe I will have some different opinion regarding the exchanges between the universities and the Chinese students that are studying in Europe, and I'll give you some examples from Lithuania. So, but
We'll
that's
be able
for
to compare that.
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, Olas and Otto for having me here. It's always a bit difficult to explain why someone from Norway should be part of a Baltic conference. Well, simply because some of the mountain snow that melts in Norway ends up in the Baltic Sea through Sweden. So that's the reason why I'm here today. No, I've known the two gentlemen for some years, so I'm really happy to be here. Yeah, the Norwegian higher education sector and research sector and China, what can we say about that? Well, there's a lot of things going on. Some of them are not debated at all. Other things are debated, but mainly from the perspective of academic freedom. And then finally, there are some issues that are debated and are also securitized, so are debated from the perspective of security issues. If you look at the cooperation in this sector, then it is important to mention that Norway and China relations have been a bit difficult for a longer period, actually from 2010 to 2017, following the Nobel Peace Prize that was given to Liu Xiaobo in 2010, independent committee and so on, but of course perceived by China as an act of the Norwegian government. It took 7 years to normalize the relations between the two countries, and part of that normalization was the normalization agreement with a lot of sub-agreements, and one of the sub-agreements dealt with research cooperation. So we have had research cooperation before, but you can see that with this normalization agreement, there has been some sort of a boost in actual research cooperation. There are many projects. Actually, as a researcher, it's a bit frustrating not to put numbers to that, not to be able to do that. But there are so many projects going on with Chinese partners, both projects that are run by universities, research centers, but also in the private sector, that it's almost impossible to get a good overview of that. What we do know, and that is what you also mentioned, is that a lot of that cooperation is about technology. It's about hard science, not so much about the social sciences or the humanities. What kind of things are not debated? What is not debated in Norway is the presence of Norway and other Nordic countries in China through research centers that are established in especially Shanghai. There are two research centers where all of the Nordic countries cooperate with Chinese partners. And I think they are not debated because they are multilateral and because they are in China. So it's not perceived as something that poses any risk. Then, of course, we also have the Confucius thing. We used to have a Confucius Center in Bergen, part of the Bergen University. That was established in 2007, and it was ended in 2021, basically because of the feeling that academic freedom was at risk. On the other hand, we can see that Oslo has taken over a center that was before at the University of Copenhagen, the Fudan European Center for China Studies. And that center was ended in Copenhagen, again for reasons of fear of infringement of academic freedom. But Oslo University decided to take it over. But again, this is very much debated from the perspective of academic freedom. Then there is a research cooperation in Spitsbergen, an island, actually a number of islands with Spitsbergen as the main island up in the north, in the Arctic, where we have the so-called Arctic Yellow River Station, which is a Chinese research center that deals with geology, Arctic stuff. That is a special case in the sense that it is part of the wider discussion on Spitsbergen and the Spitsbergen Treaty. Those of you who are not familiar with the case of Spitsbergen, it is Norwegian territory, but at the same time, the treaty says that it is demilitarized and that all the parties to the treaty, including China, can do business on Spitsbergen. And increasingly that is perceived as something that, also because of climate change and so on, could present risks. And the Norwegian Research Council is trying to get some sort of a hold, trying to get some sort of a coordinating role in the research that goes on Spitsbergen. But there is a lot of tension between the Norwegian Research Council and the Chinese counterparts. Then finally, what is really securitized is the presence of Chinese researchers in Norway. Not just their presence, but also presence from researchers from India, Pakistan, Iran. But because currently foreign researchers from China are in the majority when it comes to foreign researchers in Norway, that's also true for student exchange, for example. Increasingly there is a debate about whether those researchers that are not, to put it simply, from NATO countries should get some sort of a clearance, some sort of a research license before they can get into the country and do their work. Another issue is that currently all kinds of technology that is exported from Norway that involves military use or could involve military use and the dual use things are subject to export controls, but a lot of knowledge exchange that takes place between researchers, Norwegian and Chinese researchers, is not looked upon as that kind of high risk export control. So that's another discussion. Should there be export control of knowledge exchange in the higher education sector? Yeah, that's basically what I had to do.
Thank you very much for the wonderful brief presentation that our experts gave. Perhaps we can summarize two major directions that the examples brought forward by our experts would indicate. One of them being the matter of public diplomacy that has been an objective to achieve by utilizing academic freedom perhaps to means other than those that they were intended for. At the same time, it is also the question of economic diversification in terms of technology exchange, knowledge exchange, and investment, both from a perspective of being able to get something for free or with less effort than it would take with regard to national capacities. On the other hand, it is also the concern for China to be able to keep up and remain at the level of economic rankings than it used to have, especially with regard to some difficulties that we can see on managing the pandemic and managing some of the social and demographic issues that China now knows that, for example, we in Europe have already known very well. Perhaps one question that I would like to ask to all of my panelists here is the question of science funding. We know that in many European countries, including the one that I come from, frequently scientists would bring up the issue of what support is provided by the government, what support is, for example, provided in the European or other multilateral aspects. Do you think that part of the Chinese appeal in their presence in the education has been this ability to provide something that is either financially impressive or perhaps attractive in other aspects of resources that would come with. We have known these different programs to provide for Chinese language teaching, different programs involving, let's say, directors of secondary schools being invited to China, and other bilateral and multilateral projects where perhaps China could offer something that scientists in our own countries would seem as lacking from the offer that they would have from their own government. Would anyone would like to comment on that? Is that an issue that you could see in the case of your countries or in any regional arrangements?
Yeah, I can start. Now, in the case of Norway, research funding is basically from the Norwegian government and increasingly from participation in EU programs. And China is not at all perceived as a potential research funder. At the same time, if you look at the actual programs of a lot of Norwegian funders, then international cooperation is important, and also international cooperation with a country like China. So to a certain extent, the idea is that if you want to get funding, you should also include international partners, and it may be a good idea to include a partner from China in order to get your funding. If you look at actual research cooperation, then there has been some research done in Norway that looks at, for instance, co-authorship, which is important, and then it turns out that currently China is the fourth most important partner for Norwegian researchers in terms of co-authorships, which is something that surprised me quite a lot when I read that. At the same time, you can see that if you look at research funding, then a lot of Nordic countries are really directed at, oriented towards EU funding, much more than oriented towards funding that includes China. They are in two different groups. On one hand, Nordic countries, EU, and on the other hand, you have China, also the US, and countries around the Pacific.
Yeah, maybe I could add something to that question. So from the Polish experience, we've got a couple of sources as sinologists or researchers. So first we've got Polish funds, so we can apply for projects and realize some research stays in China, for example. So I did that from the Polish funds. And I would say if China has sponsored like me this stay, I would also go for it, and my conclusions would be the same. So it's also important like to treat everything one by one. And I think it's not, that easy to like influence the researchers to like, give up their values and like change their research. I think that's very controversial because it somehow really is kind of critical to our autonomy as researchers. So I wouldn't say that if someone accepted 1 year stay from China, he's compromised by Chinese values, because this is for sure like ridiculous, and I haven't been on such a stay. So I'm just telling also that for my colleagues who have done that. There are also Taiwanese scholarships that are available, and many Poles are using them to spend research couple of months in Taiwan. We've got EU funds, and we've got the Chinese and Taiwanese and Hong Kong funds, and sometimes like also German foundations are somehow helping to organize certain research stays. So I would say there is a diversification of available funds, which means that no one is pressured to compromise their values. Of course, I think that it's different in social sciences and in like philosophy, humanist studies, where we should be as open as possible to have dialogue with China, because we are also influencing them by our values and by our narration and by our stories. So this is a thing we shouldn't forget about, that we have a lot of soft power when we go to China. But of course, there's another situation with technical studies, with genetic studies, and we know that there were attempts from the Chinese side to go into biological and genetical studies, which is kind of, shady a little bit. So, depends on the domain. It should be like the decision should be made. Do we do that with China, or do we do that with any country that is authoritarian? Because I think the same set of values shouldn't be like anti-Chinese, when we build something within the EU, it shouldn't be anti-Chinese. It should be like anti, for example, autocracy, anti-fascist, anti-totalitarian, et cetera. So then we are not pointing against China, but we point against the systems, political systems that don't have much to do with our values. And just a side remark, if we look at Central Asia, there is absolutely like other perception of Chinese funds in countries like Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan, where Chinese money really plays a role, because the students, they don't have access to, or they have access but limited to European funds, for example. So China is a real alternative for them. So it's also important to look at that the map of the world is like really diverse. So what we experience in CEE or in the Western Europe, when often like using Confucius Institute for many of my colleagues was like having an adventure, and like living in Asia. And they often like didn't even continue their interests in China. So I think it's important just to, have these cases by one, and really to have more qualitative studies rather than quantitative, like the trackers, for example, like really to see, what was going on during these academic exchanges, to have a real evaluation of that, because we cannot stop like academic exchanges, for example, in social sciences with China, because we will not erase China. Like, we still need that knowledge, So it's important to find a balance and a way, in between.
Thank you. Now, perhaps I would open the floor for questions from the audience, so that we would be able to perhaps look at some of these aspects a little more wider perspective. So perhaps, if I may ask your help. Yes, we have one question at the end.
And the second, first
right
is Mr. Saran. I saw your hand first.
Thank you. I agree very much with what you all said. It's very interesting and relevant. I think there's one thing one should mention too, and that's the 1,000 Talents program, which you undoubtedly all know is a Chinese idea which was created to bring back good Chinese scholars who were working in the West. They would be fairly nicely paid, and one would set up laboratories and this kind of things for them back in China. It worked well, and then one decided, why not make the same for Western scholars? And they have done so, and it's purely legal to do so, at least in Denmark, as long as you tell your boss that you are working on this 1,000 talent program. China is doing it mainly in Denmark. We have 30 professors working on it. Many of them are working within turbine research, wind turbine, which is something which China is very interested in, and that is in itself not so bad. The problem is sometimes professors forget to tell that they have a laboratory in China, and they forget to tell that they have taken out patents in the name of their Chinese laboratories. And it is a thing, the program is looked upon in Denmark with great earnestness by the Danish government. It has been discussed in the parliament behind closed doors, and one is, very much aware of it, and one sees it as a potential threat. I mean, I'm not going to be the man saying China is very, very bad, but we just have to see that there has been these cases of, I would say, kind of stealing patents. There was some cases especially strong at the University of Aarhus 2 years ago. Thank you.
I liked your point just now about we can't have an anti-Chinese policy. And I probably should have said that myself, but I wasn't bright enough. But if we're not going to have a policy that's anti-Chinese, then what is the policy? That, you know, we've got to actually to say what we think the policy should be, which we're not doing at the moment.
Hello, I'm Frederick Foy from the Swedish Psychological Defence Agency, and on the other side of policy, a more detail-oriented question. We kicked out the Confucius Institute as early as 2012. The last Confucius Classroom was out by 2018. However, we are now seeing indications that the PRC are trying to monopolize the Chinese language training for elementary and high schools. Is this something you see in your respective countries? Could we sense that there will be an overreaching strategy for example, the Nordic-Baltic region or otherwise?
So if I may respond to that in the particular case of looking at what is the situation in Latvia, then indeed we saw cases of that being the policy of the Chinese government. For example, in one of the education institutions that I had the chance to visit and speak on the matter, I was informed that even though there was an interest from the students to learn Chinese, and they were able to get a Chinese teacher by themselves, the Confucius Institute reached out to that teacher and was very persistent in trying to have this arranged via the institute, even though the school was able by itself to provide for teaching this. So we can see that it is not an isolated situation. It is part of this trend of trying to keep the hand on the pulse and try to be in charge or control in some way what is being taught, and also who are the teachers, who are the instructors, and find a way how to be involved. So that is the case in Latvia, and I know that is not only limited to that part of the Baltic Sea region. So.
I had a quick idea came to my mind with regards to the previous question. What is the policy, or what should it be? I think there are some areas where we can try to take a nuanced step. For example, when we're talking about the maritime dimension, there is space, I believe, to show that the West, Europe and North America stands firmly for a liberal maritime order, an UNCLOS-based, rules-based order, and still doesn't have a negative attitude against China per se. For example, with regard to the South China Sea, we could take, and I mean we're doing it, but take a very tough stance towards China's illegitimate demands, whereas on the other hand, China's naval presence at the Horn of Africa, their contribution, and they've had a very long and very substantial contribution, I would say. Germany, I don't know when we've deployed the last time a naval unit for standing deployment there. The Chinese have had a significant deployment for more than a decade now. We could, for example, show that we are welcoming that deployment, and we are very welcome to accept a great power China as a responsible stakeholder in this world. I think if we are looking very carefully at different policy areas, we can find opportunities to show a nuanced view. But this, of course, necessitates a very carefully designed strategic communication strategy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I was really shocked, like a couple of months ago, when the UN High Commission for Human Rights spoke with China and didn't really, comment on the situation in Xinjiang. I was like, really shocked. If not her, then who, should react? And I think that's, I think we should maybe think about more, maybe today in the other panels. But just up to your point, I think that everything that is connected to high technologies should really get a very good training on what are the risks and really conduct, a very good assessment whether it will pay off or not and what are the risks. Because as you told, we had a lot of situations in which the trade secrets or technological secrets were stolen by China. Now it's not such a huge problem now in Poland because our technology, we have technology, but it's not number one in the world. Germany has more of that problem, so it also depends where you operate, but for sure everything that's connected to technology and ability to steal and do technological advancement should be double checked. And what the policy strategy should be, that's a very good question. I actually was answering that in Georgia, and because in Georgia, the political elites are, for example, pro-Chinese. It's not the case in Poland, but in many places, I think what's important is to put damage control in place, because we have to interfere with all these countries. I think putting a stop, a block is not an answer. So I think it's important to first of all, diversify, for example, panelists during debates or whatever we do, to have a couple of viewpoints on the same situation. So omit any kind of, one-way conferences where there are only panelists, for example, chosen by the embassy of China, which was happening in Poland, okay? So that's one of the ways out of it. Then remember always that influence is not a one-way road, so we can also influence the way they think and open the up to certain ideas, just as it was in the 70s, 80s, when China had huge debate on political transformation. And for example, there were people traveling to Sweden, learning about social democracy and so on. Leverage network of contact, I think that's very important, is to be collective, be in a group. For example, build up, an open letter, for example, if certain rights are compromised, research rights are compromised, write a letter, for example, to the Chinese side, putting the points, and really communicating that to them. I think that's a very successful way. We actually did that at the Boym Institute when Ukraine was attacked. We clearly stated what we think about that and how we condemn the Chinese decisions that they didn't act. We didn't put there any names, but we sent us to our network of over 120 experts in China, because we have these contacts from, trips to China, and we told them what we think about that straight away. So that's one of the ways, not to be scared, of that, of really, being in a bigger group. And we can discuss about that later on. I just wanted to answer the language training in primary and secondary school. So that's also happening in Poland. We have that in the publication. There is one city, for example, which has the Chinese classes. I think it's a thing we should consider and be critical about it, to see what effects it has in the long term. And I think whatever we do, the most important thing is to have knowledge about the risks, to have the debates and assess them, and then also to ask questions about people who are silent. So there are experts all across Europe that don't want to be critical or comment on things like, Xinjiang, human rights, freedom of speech, and they are not contributing in this way to a real dialogue and to real education, because they are silent about these controversial things. And I think the real change will come when we will be able to integrate these people a bit more, not to tell them, no, you are China's lobbyist, no, but to integrate them and to make them feel that they are in the group, and then they can speak up, about, the critical issues about China.
Thank you. And Linus.
Yeah, I have to agree on that. That's it's true that bilateral cooperations, exchange student programs might benefit. There are some positive outcomes, as you mentioned. The Chinese students can learn more about European values, culture, democracy, and in this way maybe they will influence others. However, it also brings some threats. As being a member of an organization which is primarily focuses on disinformation, debunking activities, we do a lot of OSINT things. So I just want to mention one case from our research. So in 2019, you remember the events what happened in Hong Kong. Lithuania was no exception. Some active citizens of Lithuania organized supporting events for Hong Kong, for their struggles to keep at least some democratic institutions under their hands. But while the peaceful protesters were holding Hong Kong's flags and posters condemning Chinese politics, they were joined by the counter-protesters who were mostly members of the Association of Chinese Expatriates and Students, Chinese students living in Lithuania. Crucially, the incidents in Lithuania proved to be a qualitatively novel development in this field, as it marked the first time that pro-Beijing protesters actively participated in the open event in Lithuania. Chinese embassy, of course, tried to present the gathering as a spontaneous act, but it's good that we have like open source things and we have internet. So just simply by doing the small research, we managed to see that Chinese diplomatic corps took active part in it. The ambassador, the defense attaché, his deputy, and the second secretary of the embassy participated in there. Moreover, all the banners, all the transparents that the protesters, the students, and the Chinese minority living in Lithuania brought to the event was taken out of the cars which had like a Chinese embassy plates. So this is some kind of I don't know if they're working that bad that they're giving out the students like the transparents from their cars with the embassy car plates. So I'm pretty sure that there are some positive aspects of student exchanges, but we have to keep in mind that there are some great risks, and as all the intelligence report says, that there are some tricky parts behind Chinese students in Western countries as well.
Indeed, as you can see, it is very challenging. We will have time for one short question before the lunch break.
Yeah, thank you, Didi Kirsten Tatlow. I'll be speaking later. I really wanted to just say that I think that I very much get the sense that we're looking at the tip of the iceberg still only when we deal with China in Europe. And I'll give a very brief example. The gentleman over there quite rightly pointed to the 1,000 Talents program, but there are, in fact, of course, perhaps 500 to 600 talent programs operating in China, run by the government or on behalf of the government. It's again, we get back to the issue of scale, which we talked about earlier. And so I suppose my question is to the speakers: do you feel that your respective environments / countries, that the political leaders who are obviously European, do they really understand what's going on? Do they really are they devoting the capacity to the financing, the investment in people, in skills and knowledge to truly define the issues and to get as much information as possible and then to be able to act on them? What stage in the road do you think that you are?
I won't talk about the political leadership. But maybe the leadership of the German Navy gives a very clear development, I would say, how things have gone. The chief of the German Navy from 2014 to 2021, Vice Admiral Krause, had a very strong personal relationship with China. He got along very well with his Chinese counterpart. He visited China frequently. The Chinese were very smart in using cooperative naval diplomacy to develop relations. I won't quote the whole interview now, but yeah, Krause was very up to the point that we have to differentiate what China is doing in Asia and the South China Sea, and what they're doing in the Baltic Sea is completely different, and we have to think in two different categories here. And of course, he received criticism for these views, but that's what it was like. And of course, it also resembled this kind of, well, we have to differentiate the view on China depending on economics and human rights and so on, to a certain degree also what the German government under Chancellor Merkel was trying to do. And as some of you might know, we had some changes in the German naval leadership lately, mainly because of an interview the previous chief of the German Navy gave in India. He had to step back because of his remarks concerning Ukraine and Russia, and I'm not going to talk about this at any point now. But what is interesting is his view on China. So what he basically said was that we need to team up with the Russians. I mean, now we are talking from hindsight. This was before the invasion, so I have to take that into consideration. But we need to team up with the Russians to deal with China. This raises a sincere question, I would say. What kind of image do you have in your head of China that makes you think that you need to team up with Putin to deal with him? That China is such a big threat that you even consider teaming up with the Kremlin to deal with the Chinese. This has been a change in the course of 180 degrees within a very short amount of time.
Can I correct you?
Yeah.
I would object. What kind of image do you have of Russia that you think that you have to team up with Russia?
As I said, I don't want to talk about Ukraine or Russia. I was just thinking, what image do you have of China to? Yeah.
How you like, it's fine. I have a tendency to catch a microphone and not give it away, so just let me know when to stop. I think your question is really up to the point, because the problem is that we have scholars in academia that are not really, taking care of what's going on right now, because they are researching a variety of things, maybe 5-10 years ago what was going on. Then we've got think tanks like in Poland, but there are not that many public think tanks, 2 and 1 military one, and in total we have around 4 or 5 people working there on China. And because these are public think tanks, you cannot really be critical to your own government. And you know what I mean. You cannot be really assertive. So what we see, and what's happening in Poland right now with the European Commission and EU, I won't maybe talk about too much, but also in regard to this policy of Polish government, they are not eager to be fully objective about it and to analyze it objectively, okay? So this is very problematic. And then we have think tanks like ours, which is we do PhDs, but we work abroad. So I work in a management consultancy in New York, remotely. I don't get any money for my knowledge and the work I do. We've got people in our think tank living in Ireland, working for Microsoft, people in Luxembourg, people who care, but under the current circumstances, there is not much chance that we will get any, public funding, because also there are bigger problems in Poland and Asia is really on the margin. So I would say that although there is interest in Poland, rising interest in China, what's going on there, it's still believed that it's the margin of our interests. So they're not putting enough finances into it. And then the question is, who should do that? If academicians are not really into it, the think tanks are public, then you have to do private. There is the need, there would be a need actually to build a common strategy and also build like more contacts among all, you know, the universities and institutes in Poland, because what we know, because we have interns from different cities in Poland, some of them are taught not critically, like they're not very critical about China, about the BRI. They still believe it's a huge chance, it's like nearly independence chance. And then there is another problem that in Poland we also have some really right-wing groups that are pro-Russian, which is really, you know, schizophrenic, but it's the truth. And then they are pro-autocracy, because they think that we can only be successful in our economy if we are an autocracy. So if we are like China, you know, like we really have this one person who is top of the family business, you know, and they kind of want to reproduce some of these like ideas into practice. So these are the threats that are there, and they are serious, and they're very vivid on Facebook, on, you know, Twitter and so on, and we don't really follow this information, you know, but it's happening across the country. So this is very, I would say, threatening, along also with YouTube, and there are people who just, you know, talk, like Polish people who talk about China, and they are not critical to what's going on. So when there is a Hong Kong protest, when there is, I don't know, Xinjiang, they will not tackle these problems, okay? They will be silent about it. So it's not that they are lying, but they are just silent, and this is a problem, because on the other hand, on the flip side, you don't have like enough capabilities of giving people with education and with critical mind funds to write about China. It's still like really impossible and really, really difficult. So I think it's the right question, and also to think how to bring together like our part of Europe with like France and Germany, because it's not that we are discriminated against, but we have less power, less knowledge, less skills to like integrate with Western Europe. So like some Americans sometimes ask me, why the hell, you know, there's 16 plus 1, 17 plus 1? Why did it happen? And there is one of the answers, it's part of the story, is that Poland and some of the CE countries felt that their voice on the EU level in Brussels was difficult it was not heard in Brussels, because we really lack of skills like to build like a think tank in Brussels, like we don't have these capabilities. So there is a large number of problems that stand in front of us, and it would be important to map them, diagnose, do strategy, you know, execution plan, and then to evaluate it. This is also important. But nobody is really interested in that, and you really need finances to do that well, because people need to live from, you know, something. Yeah.
Professor, would you like to add a note?
Yeah, very briefly. I think it's a key question that you asked. Are politicians aware of the threats? Do they understand China enough? I'm not Norwegian, so I'm a bit of an outsider, but that also means that I can say negative things. Yeah. I think most politicians in Norway do not even understand the EU, let alone China. So there is a problem there. If you look at the increasing awareness of potential security risks imposed by China in Norway, then there's a very important role for intelligence agencies. They have been at the forefront of, you know, pushing out reports explaining that it is really a threat that is out there. And then, fortunately, from the perspective of, I would say, Norwegian awareness, China was so stupid to attack the IT system of the Norwegian Parliament last year, and that, of course, you know, raised a lot of commotion and debate about China's role.
I would just say the last thing. Sorry. I think what is important, and I found it really disturbing during like various think tank dialogues, also like governed by Western think tanks, is that they don't want to be too controversial because they are scared they will lose contacts. So I think that's really crucial, you know, during the meetings, is to say, okay, we are European, this is our DNA. You know, it's freedom, individualism, you know, things like that are really important for us. And really not to be scared to speak up our voices, as we have this, you know, European DNA. And I was really shocked, like a couple of months, it's a very famous think tank, and I love this think tank. It's based in Brussels, and we had a discussion during COVID with really high-ranked people in Beijing. And the Beijing, like, we asked them questions, and they were also answering like, oh yeah, we took out so many people from poverty, you know, we do community of human destiny and stuff like that, you know, all the scenarios that they told so many times. And no one like stand up and told, okay, let's have, you know, a serious discussion because you are backing up Russia. And there's like a real war in Ukraine, and we're really scared of that situation. You know, and this is really really disturbing for me personally. So yeah, in the end we reacted, we stood up, but this was not very well like also received in Brussels, because this was meant to be a call, you know, to build friendship, to have dialogue, not, you know, to tell them that we completely disagree with them. But I think this is the way, what we need to do is to show really, you know, assertively, we have this DNA, we look at the, you know, things like this, and if you want to, you know, build alliance with Russia, come on, go and do it, you know? Imagine China in the 60s and 70s, like in Poland, my parents could only build vinaigrette, like buy vinaigrette in a shop. And I asked them, okay, so you can team up with Russia, go back to the 50s and 60s, like it's the West that really brought technologies, bring the value, bring the production bases and so on to China. If you like, go back to Russia, go back to the Soviet times, and you will see what's happening, you know? Like really kind of, I think we are too mild, because people are really scared to stand up and tell, you know, out of their experience what we think about them being on the side of Russia, and that they need to change, because it's not in their interest. This is the most interesting thing. It's not in their interest to be on the side of Russia. It's economically absolutely not good for them, not feasible for them. And I think it's important really to communicate very assertively with China on the situation in Russia.
Thank you. Indeed, the way how we have the impact of education is on the perspective how we evaluate and how we understand what our interests are in a given national setting. And I thank my experts on the panel on raising the awareness of this issue that is not always so very straightforward, but I think it will provide for a great discussion throughout the conference and also now as we proceed with our lunch break. Thank you very much, and let us continue at 2 p.m. Thank you.